So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this 2017 Conference of European Network of Ombudsmen. I'm Shada Islam. I'm Director for European Affairs at Friends of Europe, which is an independent think tank based here in Brussels. I'm delighted and I feel very privileged that I'll be moderating some of the debates during this exciting 2 days ahead of us, and this afternoon as well. So today's discussion is really open to a wide variety of stakeholders. Obviously, the family of ombudsmen and petition committees are here as well, but we have a large audience and participants from NGOs, international organizations, the European institutions, and others. Day 2, tomorrow, is going to be for the family of ombudsmen and petition committees only. So we're looking forward to two days of very, very stimulating and dynamic discussions. To kick off the conference today, I have the pleasure of introducing Emily O'Reilly, European Ombudsman. And Emily, I would like you to come to the lectern and make your opening statement, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Shada, and good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here. So colleagues, friends, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, could I extend a very warm greeting to all of you and thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to join us here in Brussels. Last year's seminar produced some very honest, very open and very insightful discussion about the major issues that confront us as ombudsmen, as members of civil society, as politicians and as citizens. And I am confident that over the next 2 days we will achieve the same. We managed this year, yet again, to hold our seminar at a key moment in the history of the European Union. Last year, we gathered just 1 week before the British referendum on Brexit, and today, as I speak, within the last 2 hours, British and EU negotiators have sat down, not too far from here, to begin to negotiate the terms of that separation. Last year, we also waited in anticipation for the result of the US presidential election, and today, just 5 months after the inauguration of the winner, we bear witness to the disruption across many areas of our political and civic life that the election of President Trump has prompted. But such is the pace of political change and political disruption that on a daily basis, our assumptions about what might happen next, our assessment of the forces that are fueling change, are challenged. 2016 was the year of the so-called populist. We linked Brexit to the election of Donald Trump, and some feared a domino effect across many parts of Europe. Yet the centre held in the Netherlands, a brand new centre arose in France and swept all before it, and notably Marine Le Pen's National Front, and so-called right-wing populist parties in Finland and in Germany have also struggled. Equally, the hard Brexit line championed by British Prime Minister May, as she sought to strengthen an already strong electoral position, was rejected. Although how the message of that election is interpreted or acted upon still remains unclear. Even in the US, democratic forces, perhaps made complacent through the Clinton and Obama years, have been, counterintuitively, emboldened and empowered rather than weakened by the Trump presidency. The mainstream media has recovered its energy, reasserted itself in its role as a guardian of democracy, attracted new readership and engagement at a time when the world awaited its extinction, and is acting as a powerful counterforce to the weight of the Trump administration. Equally, the US courts, long thought of in many cases as over-politicized and partisan, are also playing out their constitutional role in a way that is also providing protection from the authoritarian impulses of the new presidency. It is not all, of course, good news. There are concerns about the weakening of democratic institutions in certain EU states, where leaders view either courts or civil society or both as potential enemies of the people. The them and us mentality risks a reversal to a past which we had hoped had gone forever, and how the EU manages these important challenges will be critical to its own wider legitimacy. I look forward to listening later this afternoon to EU Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans, whose brief is precisely to support and promote democracy and the rule of law throughout the European Union. Equally, while populist parties, and particularly those of the right, may not have been voted into power or even close to it, their activism has nonetheless influenced policy-making in the centre, the clearest expression of that being, of course, the decision to hold a UK-EU referendum. Greater assistance to migrants and refugees has also arguably been stalled because of anti-migrant pressure, and the EU itself has shown itself reluctant to put pressure on reluctant member states for fear of encouraging greater electoral support for Eurosceptics and Europhobes, or perhaps for reasons of geopolitics. Our speakers on the next panel will give us their very direct experience of dealing with these issues, either from an Ombudsman or Petitions Committee perspective, the global challenge perspective of the Open Government Partnership, or the very much hands-on, on-the-ground perspective of a city mayor trying to develop a stable and prosperous integrated community. Each of us will have attempted to frame the recent dizzying political developments in a way that makes it understandable to us. Some prefer the word rejectionist to populist. Others see a world divided as between those who benefit from globalisation and those who are its victims, while more see the simple age-old divide as simply between the haves and the have-nots. Many of us also recognise it as a way of framing any political ideology that sets up whatever the particular populist is against, whether ethnic minorities or the leaders of the European Union, as a justifiable target for anger or even worse. Perhaps, and in the most tragic way imaginable, all of those forces, all of those supposed alignments or fractures were most visibly seen in the conflagration that destroyed lives, families, livelihoods and dreams last week in the London fire at Grenfell Tower. And as we reflect on that, we also think of and express our condolences to those who perished in the fires in Portugal and to their families. When the Titanic sank in 1912, with the deaths of over 1,500 people, historians, philosophers, sociologists, and many others read into it not just the fact of the sinking of the ship, but also wider narratives about class, industrialization, inequality, migration, empire, the very stuff of political and cultural debate at that time and perhaps even today. The very same phenomenon is happening with the Grenfell tragedy, as all of you will know. And it struck me as I read that commentary and observed the anger and the fear that came not from the people, but from the politicians and those charged with administering the policies that culminated in this, that perhaps when we talk about populism and globalization, that what we're really talking about is simply the ability or inability of people to exercise control over their lives, to have agency, to plan for themselves and their families, and above all, to keep themselves safe and not to rely on the transient political whims of others. And that, I believe, is where we come in, or should come in, as Ombudsman. It is our job to lend sufficient power to the people that we serve, that they are able to stand on an equal footing with the powers that shape or attempt to shape their lives. When we make the case for the person wrongly denied a home, or a hospital bed, or a disability service, or a place in which they can safely have minded an elderly parent, or for decent treatment in a refugee camp, we are giving those people the power so denied to the people who sat helplessly waiting for their death in a tower block in the richest area of the richest city in one of the richest countries in the world. How ironic indeed that the first person named as having died was a Syrian refugee. Perhaps the UK election and Grenfell will mark a change in the current Brexit narrative. Who knows? I sense an emboldened EU, others an uncertain UK. Perhaps it is time for all of us to address so-called populism with a more direct gaze at what this turbulence really is all about. The power of people to live a good life and to pass that good life on to their children. The debate should be about which system better allows that, and not, as one commentator put it, about melancholic nationalism, anomie, and sovereignty. And now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a gentleman who's very kindly agreed to open the conference with us. Mr. Vladimir Manka is a member of the European Parliament from Slovakia and holds two roles in particular that are very important for the European Ombudsman. His role as Quaestor includes Parliament's relationship with the Ombudsman, and he is also a member of the very important Budget Committee. Today, he has very graciously accepted our invitation to speak representing the European Parliament, and I am immensely grateful to him for doing so. Mr. Manka, the floor is yours.
Honourable Ms. O'Reilly, distinguished National Ombudsman, ladies and gentlemen. I am very grateful for your invitation to the European Network of Ombudsmen Conference. I would like to express my appreciation to the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, who does an excellent work aiming to improve the quality of service offered to citizens by the European administration and to increase the trust of the European citizens in the European Union. The European Parliament works in strong collaboration with the European Ombudsman. The European Ombudsman regularly gives presentation on her annual report and answers questions of members of the European Parliament at the meeting of the Committee on Petitions. Every year, the European Parliament adopts a report on activities of the European Ombudsman, where it gives its assessment and provides its recommendation on follow-up actions. Today's conference will bring an insight of topics which are highest on priority in the agenda of all European institutions. Citizens expect from the European Union real solutions, peace and solidarity, protection of their safety, and social, financial, and environmental security. I would like to stress the role of the European Ombudsman and national ombudsmen in this regard, as well as crucial importance of uniting the efforts of all European institutions to protect interests of European citizens in these very challenging times. The vote in the UK for Brexit and the rise in populism in some European countries more than ever remind us that it is vital to listen to citizens and respond to their expectations in defining the future of the EU. We have to promote good governance and conduct our work as openly as possible. Transparency and openness are crucial. Transparency in the decision-making of the European administration, which the Office of the European Ombudsman is raising with untiring efforts, is the standard to which the European Parliament is committed. Moreover, European citizens need to be assured that the European project can continue to bring tangible benefits to their lives. In this context, I encourage you to follow the upcoming public hearing of 22nd June on restoring citizens' confidence and trust in the European project, organized by the Committee on Petitions. I am very much impressed by the initiative launched by the European Ombudsman's Office in 2016 to introduce the Ombudsman's Award for Good Administration. It aims to recognize members of staff of the EU institutions, agencies, and bodies who promote good administration while performing their everyday duties. Introduction of such award puts a possible emphasis on the work of the European Ombudsman. It shows to the European citizens, but also to the staff of EU institutions, that good work and service don't stay unnoticed. It promotes good practices and encourages others to improve. Let me mention an example from my personal life. In the Slovak Republic, Transparency International undertakes a transparency survey on good and ethical governance, assessing all 8 Slovak self-governing regions. The so-called Open Self-Government Indicator measures level of transparency, quantity and quality of provided information, anti-corruption measures and openness. I am proud that under my governance, our self-governing region repeatedly ranked as the most transparent region in Slovakia. What was the key to our success? Transparent property management, open and transparent governance, transparent budget, public participation in decision-making, easy access to information, prevention of conflict of interest, building trust, integrity, public service, and promoting ethical standards, transparent procurement procedures, open personnel and media policy. Transparency is of utmost importance, and we proved that its results are measurable. Thanks to transparency and openness, we managed to secure more than 100 million euros. Therefore, I strongly believe that good and transparent governance make a difference. It significantly contributes to economic development. It improves immensely the quality of life of our citizens and encourages others to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, the result of the UK referendum on withdrawal from the European Union is, of course, one of the most complex tasks the European Union is facing today. Its consequences are subject to a great concern for the European institutions. Over 3.1 million of EU citizens are living in the UK, and over 1.2 million UK citizens are living in other EU countries. People experience uncertainty about their future and turn to us as their representatives, but also to the European institutions for protection of their rights and fundamental freedoms. Let me reassure you that the European Parliament will be closely following the Brexit negotiations, listening to citizens, communicating their concerns and standing up for their rights. We have to be very determined when protecting rights and interests of our people, because trust in the European project and unity will depend on the results of our actions. The European Union has been created for its citizens. On 5th April 2017, the European Parliament adopted by an overwhelming majority of its members a resolution officially laying down the European Parliament's key principles and conditions for its approval of the UK's withdrawal agreement. Any such agreement in the end of UK-EU negotiations will need to win the approval of the European Parliament. We stay committed. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is living one of its turning points. Difficult times bring many challenges, but they can also strengthen the unity of the European Union. Unity will help us to deliver and to demonstrate the value of the Union. In 10, 20 years' time, when we look back at the years 2017-2019, we will undoubtedly remember the UK withdrawal and all the big processes relating to it. However, the European Union in which we will then live will not be determined only by Brexit. It will be determined by the work that we do in different policy areas for the economy, jobs, environmental. And by the way, that we carry out that work both at the EU and national level. We have to actively communicate that the EU does. We have to be clear about our common values on the basis of which we build our political objectives. Good and open administration is one of them, and I trust that the continuous efforts of the European Ombudsman and the national ombudsman will help us to put it into practice and thus build trust among citizens into the European project. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very interesting and fruitful discussion today, and am looking forward for the successful cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Manka, and thank you also, Emily O'Reilly, for your introduction. So we're going to have our first session, which is about the topic of populism. And I'd like to introduce our panel and the two gentlemen who are not on the panel, but should be making the way to the stage. So let me start by introducing Sanjay Pradhan. He's Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership, which is a multilateral initiative that aims to promote the words we've talked about: openness, trust, and transparency in empowering citizens. Thank you, Sanjay. Welcome. Please, Mr. Somers. Yeah. Please. Let me introduce Bart Somers. He's the mayor of Mechelen. Mr. Somers has been awarded the World Mayor Prize in 2016 for his work in welcoming refugees and his stellar work on integration of immigrants as well in your commune. Bart Somers, welcome. Also introduce Mr. Jacques Toubon, a very well-known figure here in Brussels and in France, obviously, across Europe, the Ombudsman of France and a former member of the European Parliament. And last but not least, Gero Storjahan, which I have pronounced very well, I think, Deputy Chairman of the German Federal Petitions Committee and a member of the Bundestag. Emily O'Reilly will also join us for the panel, which, as I said to you, is about the challenges posed by populism. Before we start our discussion, we have a short video clip, which is focusing on far-right populism. But as all of us here know, populism comes in many shades and colors. There is left-wing populism as well. But this one is about far-right populism, and let's launch the video now.
Far-right populist parties across Europe are riding a wave of anti-establishment fervour, widely seen as a backlash to decades of globalisation and immigration. It's been fuelled by fears about Europe's largest migration crisis since World War II and bolstered by Brexit and Donald Trump's triumphant election campaign in the US. In France, National Front leader Marine Le Pen made it to the second round of the presidential election. Despite losing to Emmanuel Macron, she still achieved a record score, winning more than 10 million votes with her anti-Europe, anti-immigration campaign. Germany's Alternative for Germany party started out in 2013 as an anti-Euro party. It's transformed into an anti-migrant, anti-establishment party, capitalising on public anger over the million refugees and migrants who arrived in Germany in 2015. Jobbik, Hungary's radical nationalist party, has proved instrumental in blocking EU migrant quotas, although the right-wing ruling party has also adopted a tough anti-immigration stance. In Austria, the far-right Freedom Party managed to overturn the result of the presidential election in May 2016 due to procedural errors after leader Norbert Hofer was narrowly defeated. However, he was again defeated during the December 2016 rematch. Italy's populist Northern League was a key member of Silvio Berlusconi's coalition government. Its policy platform includes similarities with Trump's campaign, including economic protectionism and fighting immigration. In the Netherlands, firebrand Islamophobic Freedom Party leader Geert Wilders came second in 2017's parliamentary elections. In Bulgaria, ultranationalists entered government for the first time in May 2017, when an alliance of far-right parties, the United Patriots, formed a coalition with centre-right Prime Minister Boyko Borisov.
So, as the video points out, a very troubling overview of what's happening in Europe. But Emily O'Reilly also made some very important points. If 2016 was the year of populists, could 2017 be the year of the pushback against populists? Because we have seen some encouraging developments across Europe. And there is a new mood in Europe, a new European resilience, perhaps, and a bounce back. So we're going to start off this conversation. If I may just say to you, you really are part of this conversation. I'm just here to facilitate. I'm going to kick off by asking our panelists some initial questions, but I really do want all of you to come in very, very quickly with short and snappy questions, short and snappy comments, so we have a real interactive conversation. Those are the rules of the game. I'm going to start with you, Sanjay. So we've said, Europe today, a bit of an ebb and flow in populist waves. At the moment, we do have a certain degree of a reprieve, a window of opportunity to build up on openness, transparency, empowerment. Your open government practices, can they help in building a more resilient European infrastructure against the populists, do you think?
Yes, they can, Shada. So, hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. We are seeing an ebb and flow, as you said, Shada, but it would be a grave danger to be complacent in the face of a certain pushback in 2017. Because if you look at the underlying roots or drivers of the rise in populism, there are three, I think, of which two are enduring. So the three underlying drivers, and open government can help tackle them. The first driver, which led to the fueling of populism, was many citizens feeling that they were left behind or they were worse off in the face of losing jobs or economic insecurity from globalization and from migration. There was a sense of rising inequality. There was a sense of erosion of cultural identity. And there were fears about rise of threats of terrorism, fueled also by xenophobia. So this sense of economic vulnerability and social vulnerability sustains. That hasn't disappeared. The second driver of rise of populism was that in the face of citizens feeling that they were under siege from these threats, they saw a ruling elite, a political elite, which they felt were disconnected from their concerns. They felt that the ruling elites were living in cocoons, disconnected from their day-to-day concerns, or they were captured by special interests which favored a few at the expense of the many. So that was the second driver, and that sense remains. And the third driver was populist leaders stepped into the frame and said, we are the solution. Reject outright these ruling elites. Give power to us, to a strong leader which will speak to your concerns. So underlying this rise of populism remains an enduring citizen distrust of government ruled by elites that were disconnected, that were captured or corrupt. Now, open government is trying to address this. At the same time that all these trends were happening, I'll just share an anecdote with you. I happened to go to Canada 2 days after the US elections to meet with Prime Minister Trudeau and his team. And at the same time that citizens had expressed this violent, sort of alienation from government, Prime Minister Trudeau had published the ministerial mandates of all the ministers, which mandated deep dialogues with citizens. It's called the open dialogue system. And while I was there, 140 federal consultations were happening between the government and citizens to really understand what were citizens' concerns and how government was going to address them. In Paris, we can talk about it later, participatory budgeting has been done by the mayor so that citizens have a voice. So it goes back to Emily's point, which she said in the opening, Citizens felt they didn't have control over their lives. Can we reverse this through open government by giving citizens empowerment? And the second and final point I would make, which open government can help, is by visibly tackling elite capture and grand corruption. So give you another example from the Open Government Partnership. By the way, the Open Government Partnership, many of you may not know, was launched by President Obama and other heads of states at the UN General Assembly. It's grown into 75-country partnership. All the 21 of 28 EU members are members of the Open Government Partnership, as are many accession countries. But to give you an example on addressing elite capture and grand corruption in Ireland, where, as you know, backroom deals were supposed to be seen as a way that fueled banking crisis, Ireland used the Open Government Partnership process to create transparency in lobbying. So it was transparent which public official was meeting which lobbyist, and shed a light and open this up. In Chile, they used the similar principle of lobbying reform using Open Government Partnership, and that has had a very interesting effect, and I'll close with that, which is that citizens all of a sudden could track which politician was meeting with lobbyists, and they created an info lobbying platform by which they could not only track which politicians were meeting which lobbyists, but they could start requesting access to politicians. And all of a sudden, I think it was 40, 50,000 enhanced access of citizens to politicians that result. It democratized access of citizens to their politicians. So these are ways in which we can address the underlying drivers of citizens feeling disempowered and tackling elite capture and grand corruption.
Right, and we'll talk a little bit later on about social media playing a part in that as well. But it really is interesting, isn't it? 75 countries only so far have signed up, but they are the big ones, and they do act as role models in a sense. Monsieur Toubon, if I could come to you now, because as we saw in the video, France has of course faced its real challenge from the Front National. How has the populism affected the work you do, and how have you sort of countered and dealt with this challenge?
Merci. Je voudrais d'abord remercier Émilie Aurélie de nous avoir invités à ce séminaire et dire que je suis heureux de pouvoir prendre la parole aujourd'hui et répondre à vos questions. Au moment où vient de se terminer en France une séquence électorale qui a duré plusieurs mois et qui a donné un résultat tout à fait inédit, bouleversant toutes les structures politiques établies et y compris mettant en échec les forces populistes qui, il y a encore quelques mois, pensaient pouvoir gagner ces élections, ou en tout cas en tirer un grand parti. Donc, s'agissant des causes, des origines de la montée des populismes, je n'ajouterai que très peu de choses à ce qu'a dit M. Pradan, parce qu'il a très bien décrit ce qui se produit dans notre pays comme dans les autres, et qui relève à la fois de considérations de caractère sociologique, de caractère économique, de caractère culturel, de caractère naturellement politique, et qui est notamment marqué par le fait qu'il y a deux, et on l'a bien vu notamment dans l'élection de Donald Trump aux États-Unis, il y a deux éléments qui sont mis en avant par les populistes. Il y a d'abord la vérité. On ne dit pas la vérité. Et nous allons vous dire la vérité. Alors, naturellement, ça se traduit souvent par le fait que la vérité qui est dite par les populistes, c'est le contraire de la vérité. C'est ce qu'on appelle les fake news, naturellement. Et c'est la post-vérité. Mais c'est un élément extrêmement important. Et moi, quand j'entends un homme ou une femme politique, quel qu'il soit, d'un parti éventuellement très démocratique, sans aucun problème, commencer à dire on ne vous dit pas la vérité. Moi, je vais vous dire la vérité. C'est le début de la pente dangereuse. Parce que les vérités, elles relèvent naturellement de la science, elles relèvent de la recherche, des études, elles relèvent quelquefois, quand il s'agit de religion, de la révélation, etc. Mais les vérités ne sont pas des produits que l'on manipule pour faire avancer ses propres intérêts. Et le deuxième mot, naturellement, qui est toujours utilisé, c'est le peuple. C'est que non seulement je vais vous dire la vérité, mais que vous savez le peuple, mais que personne ne veut vous dire. Mais je vais rendre la parole au peuple. Et le peuple va pouvoir, muni de ces vérités qui sont souvent des contre-vérités, vraiment faire une autre politique. C'est ce qui s'est produit partout et naturellement, comme l'a dit très bien M. Pradens, ça consiste bien sûr à la base à trouver un bouc émissaire et les boucs émissaires, c'est les élites. Mais je voudrais ajouter simplement quelque chose qu'a dit M. Pradens. C'est que quand on est défenseur des droits, il y a un paramètre, et il y a ici beaucoup d'ombudsman et de défenseurs qui auront la même expérience que moi. Il est clair que quand il y a des millions et des millions de gens qui ont le sentiment, et le plus souvent, un sentiment avéré, je veux dire pas simplement une impression, c'est la vérité de tous les jours, c'est la réalité de tous les jours. Le sentiment qu'ils subissent des inégalités, des injustices, qu'ils n'ont pas accès aux services publics, qu'ils n'ont pas accès à leurs droits, que, en fait, ils sont traités comme, d'une certaine façon, des laissés pour compte, qu'ils sont abandonnés par l'administration, les services publics, la justice, qui devraient rendre effectifs leurs droits et qui ne les rend pas effectifs. Alors ils viennent voir le défenseur des droits, ils viennent voir l'ombudsman, qui ne peut naturellement pas tout faire. Ce sentiment d'éloignement, de non-appartenance à la communauté du droit, à la communauté des droits dans les États démocratiques qui sont les nôtres, et où, par définition, c'est à partir du droit de la loi et des droits fondamentaux que s'établit la situation de toute personne. Alors les droits fondamentaux, c'est tout dans la vie, y compris les droits sociaux par exemple. Ce sentiment de ne pas avoir accès aux droits, et qui aujourd'hui frappe des millions et des millions de personnes, ce sentiment d'abandon est une composante extrêmement importante de la montée du populisme, d'où le rôle naturellement des ombudsman, des défenseurs des droits, des avocats du peuple, s'ils arrivent à rendre effectifs pour des centaines et des centaines de milliers de personnes les droits qui ne sont pas effectifs jusqu'à maintenant, eh bien, ils contribueront à les rapprocher de la communauté, à leur donner un sentiment de plus grande justice, de plus grande égalité, et c'est la meilleure façon, naturellement, de lutter contre le populisme.
Right. So we will, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Dubon. So you've talked about people being offered binary choices, really. Truth, I tell the truth, the other is lying, and I speak for the people, the others speak for the elite, and the underlying question of inequality, of course. We will come back to the specific role of ombudsman in countering populism. I do want to turn to you, Mr. Storjohann, to hear your experience in Germany. Germany is rather unusual in the European Union in that your two leading parties are led by pro-European leaders. You have the AfD, of course, Alternative for Deutschland, but it seems to be losing steam. So I'd like your insights on that, please.
Ja, herzlichen Dank, dass ich heute auch auf diesem Panel sitzen darf und möchte als Abgeordneter des Deutschen Bundestages, aber auch als Landtagsabgeordneter, der ich 8 Jahre war, gerne meine Einschätzung zu Populisten geben. Als ich 1994 in den Landtag von Schleswig-Holstein gewählt wurde, saß ich in der letzten Reihe, weil ich nachrückte. Und hinter mir saßen Populisten, nämlich Rechtspopulisten von der Deutschen Volksunion. Da habe ich das zum ersten Mal kennengelernt, dass Stimmen, Proteststimmen sich in Mandaten niedergeschlagen haben. Wir haben in Deutschland eigentlich immer 20% Proteststimmen bei Wahlen, die aber sich auf viele Parteien zersplittert haben. Und wir jetzt aktuell die Situation hatten, dass das politische System als langweilig empfunden wurde, dass man sowieso nichts mehr ändern kann, dass es auch sehr komplex ist und sehr kompliziert. Und es ist jetzt den Populisten sowohl von links als auch von rechts gelungen, das mit Persönlichkeiten zu untermauern und diese Proteststimmen auf wenige Parteien zu konzentrieren. Deswegen haben wir die Linkspartei, die nach der Wiedervereinigung ja auch Regierungspartei im Osten von Deutschland geworden ist, insofern im Westen von Deutschland Protestpartei ist, im Osten von Deutschland Regierungspartei und Protestpartei. Und wir haben auf der rechten Seite die AfD, die sich speist aus ehemaligen Politikern, aber auch sehr vielen ehemaligen Mitgliedern der Nationalen Demokratischen Partei, also alles Rechtsaußenparteien, Splitterparteien. Ist also gekommen, weil wir eine große Koalition hatten auf Bundesebene. Und da die beiden Blöcke Union als auch Sozialdemokraten Absprachen treffen mussten, wenig Streit hatten, sich den auch politisch nicht leisten konnten, gab es Nährboden. Wir haben jetzt eine Landtagswahl in Schleswig-Holstein gehabt und meine Frau ist Bürgermeisterin einer kleinen Gemeinde, 2000 Einwohner. Und bei 2000 Einwohnern hatten wir 60 Flüchtlinge aufzunehmen. Kein Problem. Alle in Wohnungen untergebracht, keine Turnhalle besetzt. Aus der Mitte der Bevölkerung gab es Menschen, die sich um diese Flüchtlinge gekümmert haben, ganz liebevoll. Es gibt keine Proteststimmen da, wo man sich um Probleme kümmert und Probleme auch löst. Probleme gibt es dann in den Ballungsräumen, wo die Probleme halt nicht so individuell lösbar sind. Und die Menschen sich auch am politischen Prozess nicht so beteiligen können. In einer Stadt wie München, Hamburg, Köln gibt es wenig politische Funktionen, die sie als Bürger anstreben können. Wenige Stadtvertreter, 4 Bundestagsabgeordnete, 10 Landtagsabgeordnete, das war's. In Bayern, in Schleswig-Holstein ist das Leben kleinteiliger organisiert. Ganz viele Bürgermeister, kleine Kommunen, sehr viel Partizipation und dann auch sehr viel Transparenz. Sehr viel Transparenz. Ich weiß alles in meinem Dorf, in meiner kleinen Stadt. Das ist für Politiker, und jetzt kommt der zweite Teil, anstrengend. Transparenz, üble Nachrede. Ich kann keinen freien Gedanken äußern, er wird sofort zerredet. Und es gibt immer weniger Menschen, die bereit sind, sich diesem Prozess der Transparenz, der Partizipation und dem Mitmachen für das Allgemeinwohl zu unterwerfen. Das heißt, die Qualität der Kommunalpolitiker, auch die Erfahrung der Kommunalpolitiker geht zurück. Und der zweite Aspekt ist, wir haben die Grenzen für die Partizipation in den Gemeinden runtergesetzt. Ich kann also jetzt auch mit 2% des Wahlergebnisses einen Stadtvertreter stellen. Das heißt, die Städte haben inzwischen Fraktionen, 6, 7, 8 Fraktionen und nicht mehr 2 oder 3. Es ist also unübersichtlicher, was die einzelnen Fraktionen möchten. Und wenn ich dann populistisch bin und sage, alles ist frei, dann komme ich auch noch in die Zeitung. Und das heißt, der politische Prozess hat sich in den letzten 20 Jahren massiv verändert. Und das ist auch dann eine gute Basis, um populistisch agieren zu können. In Schleswig-Holstein hatten die Populisten keinen Erfolg. Sie sind reingekommen, aber auf einem geringen Niveau. Und das ist auch nicht schlecht, dass sie dabei sind, denn wir werden uns jetzt mit ihnen auseinandersetzen können. Es gibt immer ein Auf und Ab in der Politik. Ich würde mir wünschen, dass sich in der Mitte der Gesellschaft, wie wir das jetzt in Frankreich erlebt haben, dass man also jetzt zu einem Wahlergebnis kommt, wo man stolz drauf ist, okay, bei 45% Wahlbeteiligung gibt es noch einiges zu tun, dass es mehr Leute sich politisch engagieren, und zwar auch dauerhaft. Dann würden wir auch letzten Endes Erfolg haben gegen Populisten.
Tout va bien. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Bit tricky here with the headphones as well. So it's very interesting that you've focused very much on the role of local politicians, role of mayors, and the quality of the politicians is what you said, Mr. Stromberg. So I will turn to a local politician, become national politician, internationally successful. Bart Somers, you recently wrote a fantastic article, really, in The Guardian, which I think has reverberated around the globe. And you said, I've shown that a city is not defenseless against terror. And you talked about the importance of inclusive societies in dealing with issues of radicalization and exclusion. Elaborate a little bit about how you see the situation evolving.
Okay. First of all, I have to say that I'm very honored that I can be here and speak to you. Secondly, I have to say my city is not a paradise. Being world mayor is not only a gift, it's also poisonous, because everything that goes wrong now in my city, even a street is a little bit dirty. They say, how is it possible? You are the best mayor of the world. So it's not only a positive thing. But going to the subject, I strongly believe that the fight against populism, one of the first levels that can make a difference is the local level. And I truly believe that the local level will be more important in the 21st century. Barber, who just died, I think, 1 month ago, wrote a beautiful book, If Mayors Ruled the World, and there he explains very well why local politicians in the 21st century are getting more important, because society changes, politics changes, and they are best adapted for that change. I think there are three levels where the local politicians can make a difference. And it has to do with what you told, let's say the insecurity of globalization that comes in everybody's life and makes people insecure. They don't have no safe environment anymore, economically and in other ways, and they feel threatened and also abandoned by the elite. First, I think on a local level, you have to be very clear about the fact that in a multicultural environment, we need rules. And those rules have to be accepted by everybody, and they have to be guaranteed by the authorities. People feel threatened, some people feel threatened, people feel insecure, and if a local authority or the authorities at all can create an environment where those rules, where everybody has to respect each other, where there is safety again, where there are no neighborhoods that are left abandoned, where drug dealers can rule the streets, where everything is dirty, where your role model is the gang leader around the corner and not other decent people, you get a society that's in despair. So creating that, and sometimes they say there's a classical right-wing thing to do, but I think it's very important. It's also part of a social policy, because then you guarantee everybody that a government will be able to respect your basic rights as a citizen, that when you come in the public area, when you are there, you will be respected and your safety will be guaranteed. And it's very important to make those rules clearly. How more diverse your city becomes, and my city counts 130 different nationalities, the more important that is. A second thing, for me even more important, that is that we have to stand up and fight back to populists where they speak about values. We were too silent about it. And they could capture the whole debate, and they made from universal values, they shrink them to Western values. A very strange thing that happened. And then they became very Orwellian, like in 1984. They changed a lot of our values in exactly the opposite of what they are. A little bit like the Ministry of Peace in George Orwell's book 1984 was in fact the Ministry of War, but they called it the Ministry of Peace. So, for example, there are political parties who now are asking to limit the freedom of speech, to defend the freedom of speech. That's Orwellian. The discussion about, with all due respect, the discussion about the burkini, for instance. If we are saying, when a woman wears a burkini, I decide she is not free, then we are not defending our freedom. That's the start of totalitarian thinking. We decide who's free or not. That reminds me of a period in communist times when you were a dissident against the regime, you were put in a psychiatric clinic because it proves that you were insane. And it's a little bit like that we are now deciding who is free or not on the basis of our values. And a third example, there are a lot of people saying, okay, the city will be diverse, our society will be diverse, but we are not going to change anything about our habits and traditions. At that moment, we make everything fundamental values. And we kill the basic engine of our society, and that's freedom. And freedom means change. We changed our society all the time around. When workers' rights came up, when women's rights came up, and now there are migrants asking, again, on the basis of the same fundamental values, their place in our society, and of course they want to change some things about our society. So, and that's what populists do all the time. They change and they make from our values not a bridge for emancipation, but a wall to exclude people, not to include, but exclude people. And we have to speak about it again, and we have to explain it very clearly, because also that is very important, that you have a kind of basic agreement about what do we understand about our fundamental values. And that's important, having fundamental values or principles, but we have to explain them again, and we have to fight against the misinterpretation of others. And a third thing, for me very important, that is that too long we have not seen that a segregated society is a bad thing. We speak a lot about the benefits of a diverse reality and a diverse society or a city, but in reality, we live in archipelagos of monocultural islands. We live not with each other, but we live in a kind of apartheid situation, in fact. And then the problem starts because jealousy starts. Why do they get a park and we don't get a park? Why does the police control us and not them? And we and them starts then. And fighting that, trying to create one community, of course with all diverse people. Let group thinking behind us, the mistake of the classical right and left, but build on one society and make efforts of that. Because in a segregated city, everybody is closed up in a caricature of what is your identity. We reduce people to one identity, and we all know that we have different identities, and they change all the time. So make a strategy of that is for me also a very important element to fight back against populists. Because if you know your neighbor who is different, if you are in the school with people who are different, if you are in a sports club with people who are different, if in your intimate private relationships you have people who are different, then it becomes much more difficult for populists to make them the enemy and make that big distinction between them and us. For me, that are three important levels, and I can speak about hours about it, how to do it, but three things we have to do. Making one community, fight segregation, fight for our values, and create a society where rules are respected by all. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's really great food for thought. So a counter-narrative against populists which is built on inclusion and recognition of diversity, but also the authentic values of our societies and our cultures to be shared. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for all five of you, actually, on different aspects, and I will do another round very quickly. But Emily, I wanted to get you into the discussion now. The microphone, yes. When you've heard these gentlemen talking from their different points of view about the threat, the challenge posed, but also the way they're fighting back in very, very concrete way, I was wondering if you could tell us how you see the Ombudsman generally in this discussion.
Well, when I was, as I said in my opening remarks, when I was reflecting on what had happened in Grenfell and the fire in London and looking, and it'll be quite a while before people put together the full story of that. But it struck me that that was almost a microcosm of many of the issues that we've just been talking about now. And when people talk about populism and people try and frame it in different ways other than the sort of traditional ways we frame that in, I think it's very clear that what people want is not abstract political ideas or thoughts. People simply want, as I've said many times, to get up in the morning, have a job to go to, know that their family is safe, know that their jobs are secure. And what they need also is to trust that the institutions that decide on many of those things of their lives, that they can trust those institutions. And I think that is precisely the space that the Ombudsman comes in, and it can be a very delicate space that we navigate because we don't do politics, yet we work obviously in a political in a political world, and people are very quick to pull us up if we are seen to get involved politically. Yet what we do actually is political, because if you're, let's say, an ombudsman in a particular local government region in the UK, if you're an ombudsman in Greece and you're dealing with refugees and migrants and all of that, when you make an effort to make things better, whether it's the people in the tower block or the refugees trying to find out what's going to happen to them or looking for protection, in many ways what you do can be seen, in a sense, to be a piece of politics. I mean, that's why the word maladministration comes in so useful. Nobody can understand it, and yet it covers a lot. I think that is precisely the space where we come in. And I suppose looking at those issues, Grenfell and Greece and lots of other of those very sensitive political issues that we come across, I find myself thinking, well, how could an ombudsman involve themselves in that? How could you also proactively involve yourself in that? And I think among the ombudsman community, there are those of us who do not have the power of own the initiative and that we simply react to complaints. But I think, in a way, that the crisis in the EU and I suppose the global political crisis, if you want to call it that, sparked by Trump and Brexit and all of that, I think it puts an even greater moral obligation on ombudsmen to be a lot braver, actually, to be a lot more challenging in what we do, and to become much more, if you like, reactive actors and proactive actors in the work that we do. I know in my own work, particularly in relation to the populist narrative, sometimes I am accused, or my office is accused of feeding populism and Euroscepticism or Europhobia, because by definition what I'm doing is sort of dealing with complaints and perhaps wagging the finger at, be it the Commission or something else, but I don't see it that way. When I give out to my children or criticise them, it doesn't mean I love them any less. And equally, I think the European institutions, I think they can be challenged and should be challenged, and they shouldn't see every challenge as in a sort of almost a cowardly way, as something that is going to damage them and further damage the European project. And of course, a lot of the work that I do is around transparency and openness, and sometimes I can almost see the eyes glazing over, eyes raised to heaven when I mention those words. But I think it is now becoming abundantly clear with everything that has happened, and as a number of the speakers have already alluded to, that it is absolutely vital. The most vital thing is trust. And when that trust goes, there goes everything. That's right. And in comes chaos and disorder, even anarchy, and that's what we've seen. So even though I accept how difficult it can be for that transparency piece, it is so vital, because when people see what's happening in institutions and when they see that they can trust them, that is so important, and that is the thing that gives that allows the political system to do what it should do, which is to put the people, the citizens, to the front of everything that they do. And I do think maybe because it's happened so recently, I'm sort of overstating this, but I think Grenfell is going to be a moment perhaps when everybody stands back and says, how did we get here? And let us really examine this. Let's really examine our consciences in relation to this. Let's pick this apart and see how we can do things better.
Thank you, Emily. So very, very salient points. So, ombudsmen are not politicians, but everything you do, everything you say, every act is political, and actually personal is political. So braver and bolder, especially in these difficult times. Sanjay, from your point of view, from the open government point of view, how critical is the work that ombudsmen and petition committees are doing in fighting populism?
It's really critical, and I would say that open government partnership was a government-civil society partnership when it was created, where civil society would amplify the voice of the voiceless, of ordinary citizens, that governments would respond to. But in that government-civil society partnership, the third leg of the stool is missing, which is the role of ombudsmen and other independent oversight institutions, because what civil society can do is raise its voice. It can be a force for social accountability. Ombudsmen can add formal accountability to that voice and give it teeth, and thereby become a source of giving teeth and empowerment to citizen voice. Let me illustrate this with a concrete example. And here I'm talking about oversight institutions, including ombudsmen, but other institutions as well. So I will take you to the Philippines, pre-Duterte Philippines. And in the Philippines, and this is again at the heart of alienation of citizens. So in the Philippines, ordinary citizens needed to access transportation, roads. They needed roads. And there was money pouring into roads in the Philippines, but it had been estimated that 30 to 40% of the money that went into roads was stolen or misused. But ordinary citizens had no voice. And what you will see in this example is a very skillful coalition between oversight institutions, reformers in government, and civil society. That's what we need. So what happened in the Philippines, pre-Duterte? Reformers in government wanted to change the system, but they couldn't on their own. So they created a transparency platform, exactly what Mr. Manka talked about. They disclosed all of roads expenditures online, and they geocoded it. Geocoding means if I'm a citizen, I can see online where the roads were supposed to be located. That was step one. That was reformers in government doing their bit. Step two was civil society started to mobilize citizen feedback using mobile phones on whether the roads existed and what were the conditions of the roads. Civil society and citizens said, but these roads don't exist or they're very poor quality. But nothing was happening. Then came the role of the independent oversight institution, which was the Commission of Audit of the Philippines. What Commission of Audit did is it started mobilizing citizen feedback, civil society social audits, and integrated it into its formal audit. And once it's integrated it into a formal audit, the government was mandated to respond. And when the government was mandated to respond, they found ghost roads, which saved the Philippines $300,000 per ghost road. That's an example of empowering citizens, amplifying and elevating their voice, and ensuring accountability when they felt an unresponsive state. In Georgia, where there is a lot of instances of elite capture and grand corruption, the Supreme Audit Institution of Georgia, another independent oversight entity, started mandating disclosure of political party finances, and civil society, Transparency International and others, started tracking whether political donors to political parties are benefiting from public contracts.
Right.
I use these two examples to show to you that the frontier in the role of ombudsman is to enhance the citizen voice, but also to forge coalitions with reformers in government and civil society. The frontier is not for ombudsmen to do it alone, or for reformers to do it alone, or for citizens to do it alone. I think that entrenched networks of corruption require coalitions. And I certainly feel ombudsmen are a missing third piece. Let me just close with one final point, Shada, if I may. Very interesting example from Costa Rica, and I'm just taking you to a tour around the world from OGP. All of these are examples I'm giving on what OGP, Open Government Partnership, government and civil society are doing. In Costa Rica, the Ombudsman of Costa Rica has created a transparency index of all public entities, which ranks all public entities based on 4 criteria, including access to information, citizen participation, and so on. And in doing so, it has created an overall enabling environment where there's a healthy competition amongst the political entities. And I want to acknowledge Emily's initiative to give good awards that you're giving for good public administration. This takes the agenda upstream And it also generates a healthy dynamic. And once again, the coalition point, the Office of the Presidency, I believe, has started to use this information to make sure that agencies are taking corrective action. So I leave you with that point that I think ombudsmen can play a very important role. For us, they can be the third leg, the missing leg of the third leg of the stool. But above all, they can be part of this coalition that is needed to fight against populism. It's not going to be easy, but you need a countervailing force. And that countervailing force acquires collective courage by joining hands with others.
Right. Coalitions working together, creating platforms, acting as a catalyst in a sense. Monsieur Toubon, does this resonate with you as the role of an ombudsman in a country, in a society like yours?
Moi, je crois que il y a dans notre situation française, issue des élections, quelques éléments de réponse, ou en tout cas quelques voix que je pourrais qualifier d'espoir. D'abord, je veux revenir sur une notion qui a été développée par M. Pradhan. Il est clair que l'origine, en tout cas historique, de beaucoup de ces mouvements et de leurs exactions remonte au lendemain du 11 septembre et à la volonté de lutter contre le terrorisme en faisant la guerre, War on Terror. Et il est évident qu'à partir du moment où on s'inscrit dans la guerre, on emploie les moyens de la guerre.
Et la terminologie aussi.
Et que les mots ont une grande importance. Quand le 16 novembre 2015, le président de la République française, François Hollande, est allé devant le Congrès du Parlement et que 3 jours après le massacre du Bataclan, où 130 personnes avaient été tuées par les terroristes de l'État islamique, il a commencé par son discours en disant « c'est la guerre ». Et à partir de ce moment-là, il s'était inscrit sur le terrain de ceux que l'on veut combattre. Donc, je dis simplement qu'on a là un point d'origine historique et politique. Et, naturellement, ce qu'on en déduit, bien sûr, à partir du moment où c'est la guerre, à partir du moment où il faut tuer l'autre pour se protéger soi-même, etc., c'est que toute politique repose sur un discours identitaire et sur une politique d'identité, puisque par définition, immédiatement, il y a eux et nous, eux et nous. Et, bien entendu, de manière soft, c'est le racisme en parole, et puis de manière beaucoup plus violente, c'est la guerre à eux pour nous protéger nous. Or, ce qu'a dit M. Pradhan, et qui est très vrai, c'est qu'il n'y a pas une identité. Toutes les identités sont multiples, et en particulier, c'est pour ça que j'en parle à propos de la France. La France a été construite, elle a une identité nationale qui est multiple, qui est diverse, qui est complexe, et qui a été construite au fil des siècles par l'immigration et par tous les apports que l'immigration a pu faire. Et on dit toujours, la France, c'est les États-Unis de l'Europe, c'est tout à fait vrai. Donc, je dis ça parce que simplement, il faut bien revenir aussi au fait que le populisme, ça n'est pas seulement tout ce qu'on a dit tout à l'heure, c'est aussi une attitude à l'égard de la démocratie et à l'égard du droit qui, reposant sur un phénomène identitaire, par définition, exclut ceux qui ne sont pas dans l'identité. Et à partir de là, naturellement, tous les ennuis commencent. L'espoir que je vois en France à l'heure actuelle, c'est que ce qui s'est passé, d'une certaine façon, avec l'émergence qui a conduit à l'élection du président Macron et à la majorité parlementaire hors des partis politiques traditionnels qui a été élue hier à l'Assemblée nationale, c'est qu'en fait, la société civile s'est mise en marche. et que d'une certaine façon, prenez ce que je vais dire naturellement, littéralement, ne me caricaturez pas ce que je vais dire. Le mouvement En Marche, ce qu'a fait M. Macron, c'est du populisme, mais dans le bon sens de ce mot, c'est-à-dire qu'il a fait que la politique s'est déroulée du bas vers le haut, et non pas comme elle se déroule toujours aujourd'hui, du haut vers le bas, ce qui est à la base des mouvements populistes qui disent il faut que nous reprenions le pouvoir parce que c'est ceux d'en haut qui l'ont monopolisé. Et dans ce mouvement En Marche, à travers des personnes qui n'avaient rien à voir avec la politique, rien à voir avec les partis politiques, rien à voir avec les institutions, il a fait s'exprimer effectivement, au moins, il faut le dire honnêtement, une partie de la société civile. Et aujourd'hui, et je rejoins ce qu'a dit mon collègue allemand, aujourd'hui, le défi, c'est que la moitié des électeurs ne s'étant pas dérangés, ça veut dire que la société civile qui s'est mise en marche et qui offre incontestablement une vraie solution par rapport aux solutions que proposent les populistes, ce n'est qu'une partie du peuple français, ce n'est qu'une partie de la nation. Et que le défi dans les 5 ans qui viennent, c'est que ceux qui ne se sont pas reconnus, ceux qui ne font pas partie d'une certaine façon de ces personnes qui sont plutôt des personnes instruites, des personnes expertes, des personnes connaissant le monde extérieur, je veux dire, qui ont une ouverture, oui. Que toutes ces personnes-là, qui sont notamment celles que j'ai décrites dans ma première intervention, celles qui sont éloignées des services publics, éloignées de l'accès aux droits, qu'on appelle dans les études sociologiques périphériques, eh bien que toutes ces personnes se retrouvent demain par la politique qui sera suivie par le nouveau gouvernement et la nouvelle majorité, incluses. Et donc aujourd'hui, il y a un mouvement qui est parti, qui incontestablement casse l'emprise des partis populistes, mais ce mouvement, il faut qu'il devienne un mouvement d'inclusion si on veut effectivement réussir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I will ask both of you to come in as well, but before I do so, I want to see how many people would like to come in at this point. I see one hand going up, but I'm sure there are more. I see 2. Anyone else wants to come in at this point? Okay. Gentlemen, I will come back to you on these issues, but let's take a few questions from the floor now. The lady over here, you put up your hand? Yes, please keep your hand up if you want, so there are roaming microphones. I did give the floor to the lady first, but please give the microphone here. Could you keep your hand up, please, so we know? Please identify yourself, and I do urge brevity, please.
Ja, also herzlichen Dank auch für diese wirklich sehr inhaltsreiche Diskussion. Ich bin Bea Böhlen, ich bin seit 6 Jahren Petitionsausschussvorsitzende des Landes Baden-Württemberg. Und mir kam in der Diskussion der Petitionsausschuss an sich ein wenig zu kurz, also jetzt außer bei Ihnen, Herr Steuerhahn, vielen Dank. Und zwar deswegen, die Ombudsleute sind keine Politiker, haben wir vorhin gehört, aber natürlich die Mitglieder der Petitionsausschüsse, und sie sind Teil der Legislative und können somit natürlich an die Exekutive gehen und sagen, wo der Schuh drückt, wo die Menschen ein Bedürfnis haben. Und so wie unser Ministerpräsident eben auch sagt, dass die Menschen, also Kretschmann, dass die Menschen gehört werden, aber nicht immer erhört werden können. Ich glaube, das ist das Ziel, das wir verfolgen müssen, dass wir sagen, wir hören euch zu, aber es gibt auch Grenzen dessen, was ihr leisten könnt, und dafür sind die Petitionsausschüsse zuständig, und das wollte ich jetzt nochmal betonen. Danke.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that question. Gentleman at the back over there, and then there was someone, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Angelos Harlaftis, Epafos Advisors. I represent here at the EcoWaves movement, the pan-European and Mediterranean movement, which is based in direct democracy, in science and in ecology. We express the section of the movement, safety and security. So the question is to the Honorable Ombudsman, if a citizen who is a populist is asking for your advice, it won't be given, because in this way, we create again, instead of unity, as a gentleman before has spoken, we create a division. And the division in the European societies, it is known from the communist era, when we had the communists, later on we had the terrorists, which are not European and Mediterranean phenomenon, and now we are bringing the populists, which are European citizens. Our proposal is to bring them near to our system. They are not educated people. We need to improve the education, because democracy is based in education, and the education is deregulated. Ms. O'Reilly, as you know very well, when we met, we discussed this, and already we don't yet implement the Lisbon Treaty about the participatory and decision-making process for the stakeholders. Nowhere. I'm participating every day, almost 1,000 conferences, and up to the moment, there is no the stakeholders' decision-making process as the treaties are obliging the current system. We believe that these are the messages which must be given by the Ombudsman, and we have to speak about the homeless, when lately a mayor in Brussels was found corrupted and taking the money from the homeless people, and poverty, and also the corruption. These are the important issues. The populists are European citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment and question. Yes, please, the lady over there. Keep your hand up, please, so she can see it.
Thank you, Magda Stoczkiewicz. I work for Friends of the Earth Europe, which is an environmental network in Europe, based in Brussels, office based in Brussels. And thank you very much for all your thoughts. I think very welcome, very timely. I think there was one thing that I was missing in terms of the populism. For me, it started also when the language of hate has been started to be talked by the politicians, and it wasn't challenged by the legal system. And coming from Poland, I see more and more of that now happening on everyday life. People speak language of hate, and this is being accepted, and I think this really leads us in a very wrong direction. So the question, if there is any role for ombudsman in pointing to that responsibility of political leaders not to fuel language of hate. But a more specific question is also, we've been observing as civil society organizations really a shrinking space for civil society. And that's something that, if we accept that civil society plays a vital role in keeping democracy going, I think there is also a responsibility to make sure that these rights of civil society are not being endangered. We've seen this happening starting from Putin's Russia, and we thought, okay, it's Putin's Russia, everyone understands it's a particular country. But we've seen it happening in Hungary, I would say in my country, Poland as well, but also in countries like the UK, the way how civil society in a way was clamped down around the referendum is a very particular situation, and I guess across the board. So again, is there a role there for the European Ombudsman to take a stance on that?
Thank you very much for those two questions. Is there anyone else who would like to come in at this point? Gentleman there, please. Yeah, either stand up or keep your hand up. And then I'll turn to you, Mr. Sturjohann, Bart, and then go on.
Thank you very much. Thomas Jørgensen from the European University Association. So we, the university sector, feel very much that we're in the front line of this, let's say, division between, let's call them populist or the closed or the open, because we do need an open society to function as institutions. But it is, once you put the value question into it, it becomes very difficult. It's very easy for us to say, we need open borders, we need open discussion, we don't need to look at people's ethnic background or similar for what they say. It's just enough that they make good research or that they're good teachers. But on the other hand, we cannot do this when we go into the values, do it in an exclusive way. If a student come into one of our universities with stern nationalist belief, we cannot exclude this person. There's a good question whether we should convert this person in the name of the values that we have of openness, diversity, inclusiveness, and the rest of it. So there is, when you're going to the value question and not the function question, then I think that's, it becomes very difficult.
Okay, I'm going to run with those 4 questions. So, Mr. Sturjohann, could we start with you to some responses of points you want to make?
Ja, das ist ein breites Spektrum an Ideen, Meinungen. Mir fiel vorhin in der Debatte auf, dass hier zweimal der Begriff Elite gewählt wurde, dass man gegen die Elite ist. Sowas würden Sie in Deutschland nie hören. Sie haben keine Elite-Universität und Sie haben auch keine spezielle Universität, wo Politiker ausgebildet werden. Das ist also eher eine Debatte, die wir in den USA haben und in Frankreich. Und trotzdem haben wir in allen Ländern, ob es die Elite gibt oder nicht, die gleichen Probleme mit Populisten. Das kann also nicht der Grund sein. Wir haben ein Verteufeln der Politiker. Ich danke ja, dass ich heute eingeladen worden bin. Teilweise sind sie korrupt, teilweise sind sie faul. Und die Parteienfinanzierung ist auch immer zu hinterfragen. Entschuldigung, wer möchte unter diesen Bedingungen Politiker werden? Ja, das ist schwierig. Also Politiker sollen entscheidungsstark sein, sie sollen gut sein, sie sollen am liebsten ehrenamtlich arbeiten. Die gibt es nicht. Wir haben die Politiker, die wir wählen. Und wenn sie uns nicht gefallen, müssen wir ein Wahlsystem haben, dass sie nach 4 oder 5 Jahren auch nicht wiedergewählt werden. Das ist eigentlich das Entscheidende, das Wahlsystem. Die Frage nach den Petitionsausschüssen. Ich habe mir jetzt überlegt, während der ganzen Debatte, habe ich im letzten halben Jahr bewusst wahrgenommen, die Äußerung eines Ombudsmannes oder eines Petitionsausschussvorsitzenden gegen politischen Populismus. Ich habe nirgendwo was gelesen. Nirgends. Wir haben hier interne Runden, wo wir immer drüber reden. Aber so richtig ein kraftvolles Wort nicht. Und meine politische These ist, Populisten kann man durch Lösungen der politischen Probleme schlagen. Und die politischen Lösungen, die kommen von den Politikern, von den Spitzenpolitikern. Und dann sind wir wieder beim Bürgermeister. Das, was unten geleistet wird, ist ganz wichtig. Wenn das nicht geleistet wird, dann kann ich auch mit einer guten, starken Rede nicht das Problem lösen. Die Frage ist, wer wählt populistische Parteien? Sind es die einfachen Bildungsschichten? Nö. In Deutschland nicht. In Deutschland ist es sehr wohl die Mittelschicht und auch sehr viele selbstständige Unternehmer, die diese Bewegung gefördert haben. Wir machen uns das zu einfach, wenn wir sagen, es sind die einfachen Leute, die sind es nicht unbedingt und da müssen wir auch gegen an. Und jetzt auch in meiner Familie, mein Sohn läuft in der Regel mit einer roten Cappy durch die Gegend. America First. Obwohl das mit Trump immer schiefer läuft, kriege ich ihn nicht davon überzeugt, diese Mütze zu schreddern. Ja? Und je mehr ich da argumentiere, umso mehr freut er sich, dass ich mich ärgere. So, also ich beachte das gar nicht mehr, lass ihn damit rumlaufen und irgendwann wird es sich schon geben. Und genauso, glaube ich, müssen wir es auch mit den politischen Populisten machen.
You know, you were saying also, you were referring to your sons, and you were saying they don't read newspapers anymore. Do you think that the social media is affecting some of the populist trends that are emerging? You think so?
Natürlich. Als ich politisch anfing vor 40 Jahren, da gab es in meiner Heimat eine Zeitung, die hatte eine Auflage von 30.000 Stück. Jetzt freute sich, dass sie noch 10.000 Auflage hat. Und mit jeder Todesanzeige wird eine Zeitung mehr abbestellt. Und der Hauptteil meiner Heimatzeitung ist im Bereich Sport, Fußball, Handball. Das sind die Dinge, die regional gelesen werden. Ich bekomme in meinem Dorf keine überregionale Zeitung und die Post kommt gegen 15 Uhr. Wo soll ich jetzt Informationen herkriegen? Also aus den sozialen Medien. Und da ist es ganz schnell. Da weiß ich sofort morgens um 7, wo alle Blitzer stehen, also wo die Polizei überwacht den Verkehr. Ich kenne alle Informationen, wo Unfälle passiert sind, das weiß ich von der Feuerwehr. Und was im Kreistag passiert oder im Landtag, das wird nicht kommuniziert, aber natürlich irgendwann auch diskutiert. Ja? Aber ob jetzt eine Straße ausgebaut wird und ich Beiträge zahlen muss, das wird sofort wieder kommuniziert. Und wenn nicht mein Wille sich durchsetzt, ich gründe keine eigene Partei, das ist mir zu aufwendig, wenn nicht mein Wille geschieht, dann bin ich verdrossen, verärgert und der Bürgermeister hat Schuld. Das ist das Erleben heutzutage.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Bart Somers, please. The microphone? Yeah.
I feel the urge to react. First of all, I have to say, if France is compared with the United States, in Europe, we Belgians want to be Canada. But this said, we have to be careful if I... smaller Canada. If we... The smaller France also. But if we have to be careful, because if I hear the discussion a little bit, we will end with the poem of Bertolt Brecht. If the people is not good, we are changing the people and we choose a new people. We have to be careful with that. I don't believe people are stupid. I even don't believe that populists are stupid. I think they're very smart populists, people who are very well educated. But what we fight is, we fight people who reject our system. It's also, we have to be honest with each other, it's a political fight. And we don't like people who don't embrace the same values as we Democrats do. But it's not new in society. 70 years ago, there were millions of Europeans believing very strange things. Superiority of races, that was all the fault of Jews, believed in the idea that a leader, a natural born leader could help us better than democracy. And with millions we believed it. So it's not a new thing, and again we see in another form people who reject our political system, our values, and then it's indeed a fight for the hearts and minds of people. And that's not an easy thing to do. And we may also not make the mistake that we follow with them every pessimistic idea and concept about the way we are organized. When I look around as a mayor, but also as a politician, in the civil society, you cannot say we need civil society, but people are stupid. It's one or the other. We need civil society because there are a lot of smart people in our society who can help democracy, who can help the decision-making process to make it stronger with forms of direct democracy, with more transparency, with involvement. And that's one of the things we have to do. We have to understand that the world is changed, that people don't accept hierarchic arguments anymore. They want to be involved, they want to be listened to. And if you do that in a good way, and that's, we have to experiment with it and we have to try to find new ways, we have to understand that we live now in a horizontal society. And that's maybe one of the reasons, if you read Barber, he will explain that the natural attitude of a local politician is that he knows that he works in a horizontal environment and not in a vertical environment. So he knows he's not in charge, but he has to mobilize a lot of people and a lot of organizations to come to that decision-making process. There's also, for me, a role of an ombudsman. An ombudsman does not only have to take in complaints and bring them up and make them formal, but also explain the importance of having a system, a democratic system that has to be transparent, where people have rights and they can ask that their rights are respected, and that's an added value for everybody of us. I think that's for me a very important point. So for me, I'm not a pessimist. Let's be honest. 6 months ago, the same meeting here, we were all saying at that time, Le Pen would win, Alternative for Deutschland would gain an enormous success, Wilders would win the elections, in Austria there would be an extreme right president, and what we see, 13% for Wilders, 13%, 8 members of parliament of Le Pen. So there is a possibility of countering that. And if you look who wins then, that are not people with another pessimistic view, not an alternative pessimistic view. There are people who give perspective again, give hope again. Because our society and our democracy, that's the last point I want to make, will stand or fall also with the concept of social mobility. Because if you go to the core of our society and why our society can be more attractive than every other model, that is that we say to every individual, if you work hard, if you do your best, if you use your talents, you can get a better future for yourself and your family. And what do we see today? That promise is broken for too many people. Sometimes by racism and discrimination that keeps people under the social mobility ladder, give them not enough opportunities on an irrational basis, namely racism, but also in other ways, that people don't see any perspective anymore, that even if they try hard, they cannot get a better world and a better future. So that's one of the things we as a society also have to think about. How can we restore that central basic promise we make in our society to every person? And if we try to do that in new ways, I think you strengthen immediately the belief in our model and in our democracy and in our rule of law.
So Bart, on a daily level, how much of a struggle is it for you to actually implement all the sort of aspirational and very noble ideas that you have? I mean, how difficult is it to do it on a daily basis in your outreach with the citizens, with your police forces, with the local administrations?
I think it's for us all a very difficult thing, and the most difficult thing is now we need courage now. You will not defeat populism by being kind of mini populist or a little bit populist. Now you have to confront. You have to take the confrontation on, and that means, for example, in the thing I work a lot with is the diversity. That you have the courage to say to everybody that as long as we stay in a narrative saying that they have to adapt to us, and they are the third generation in cities in Europe, the fourth generation sometimes. They have to become like us, and we don't have to do any effort. We will not win the game. Mm-hmm. We have to be able to say that everybody has to do efforts in this new reality, this new diverse reality of the 21st century. And it means that not only them, but also we have to think, what can we do to create a diverse society that functions well? And what are the efforts I have to do? And not only they have to do it. And a courageous narrative like that is sometimes confronting for people, but that's the way we have to go. And you see, look to European politicians of all ideological backgrounds. Who stands today? That are those who are courageous, those who have the courage to go against the stream of populism.
Mm-hmm. I think these are very important messages ahead of the European Parliament elections in 2019. I think that's going to be a big test case for whether or not the pushback against populism is going to be sustained or not.
I think so, and also look to the European level. Yeah. If Macron and Merkel can find each other again, yeah, and they can start up the engine for Europe again, and they can create a new perspective for Europe, yeah, then of course you get enthusiasm again and optimism. And in a very weird way, Mr. Trump is helping us a lot. Because you see what will happen when populists take over. So a lot of people have a second thought now, say, no, that's not what we want. Maybe the son of my colleague here, but the rest of us see the danger. And he will see it, of course, after a few months also. It's just for teasing his dad.
Yeah, but Gero, you need to get a cap which says, make Europe great again, you know? Change the narrative on his cap. I'm going to turn now to the other panelists for some opinions, but before I do that, just one quick look at all of you to see if there's anyone else who wants to come in at this point very quickly. Thank you. Please do. Could you keep your hand up so my colleagues can... There's a lady there? Yeah. And then I'll turn to you, Mr. Thubon, Sanjay, and finally to Emily.
Preguntaba si había traducción española. Sí. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. He escuchado con mucho interés y tengo algunas lógicas discrepancias. Yo creo que ante los populismos no podemos ceder en los valores fundamentales. Aquellos países que hemos conseguido con esfuerzo, con tragedias, con dramas, con sangre, llegar a democracias representativas. Y los populismos cuestionan la democracia representativa. Es el elemento fundamental de lo que están cuestionando en este momento. Excitan, promueven, levantan sentimientos, no se apoyan en razonamientos. Y no es muy difícil excitar sentimientos cuando hay crisis, cuando hay tragedias, cuando hay dramas. No es muy difícil. Y buscan a un salvador, buscan a una autoridad suficiente para poner solución al problema.
Madam, could I also ask you to be just briefer because I want to go back to the panel. Please, go ahead.
Buscan una autoridad, buscan una solución. Es la autocracia. Y esto lo sabemos muy bien en Europa y en España, pero no solo en España, lo hemos visto en el siglo XX, en varios países que hoy estamos afortunadamente en la Unión Europea. Es un retroceso enorme el populismo, es un retroceso con aires de modernidad, de participación, de redes sociales, pero es un retroceso a sistemas políticos superados. Y a mí me parece que son enormemente peligrosos. Hemos hablado aquí del populismo fuera de Europa, del populismo del señor Trump, desde luego. Pero, ¿y el populismo de Venezuela?
Madam, please, if I could ask you to just wrap up, because I want to turn back to the panel.
Yes.
You've made the very good points, and
that's all. That's all.
But that's very, very good. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so let's get back to Monsieur Toubon, and then Sanjay, and then finally to Emily.
Je vais rebondir sur ce qu'a dit notre collègue Becerril, parce que je suis tout à fait d'accord avec elle. Chez beaucoup de leaders populistes, il y a une idée simple. On combat un bouc émissaire. Et pour combattre ce bouc émissaire, il nous faut un sauveur. Et M. Sommers l'a dit, et Soledad vient de le dire, ça nous renvoie 70 à 80 ans en arrière. C'est tout à fait évident. Bien. Mais aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas seulement cela. C'est-à-dire que je pense qu'il n'y a pas seulement cet aspect de négation de la démocratie dans ses institutions, c'est-à-dire le remplacement, en gros, de la souveraineté du peuple par l'autorité d'un dictateur. Il y a, et on en a parlé toute l'après-midi, donc je n'y reviendrai pas, bien d'autres choses plus complexes auxquelles il faut faire face. Et en particulier, M. Sommers l'a dit, et je voudrais y revenir, c'est l'affaire du déclin, c'est-à-dire de l'optimisme et du pessimisme. Tous les partis populistes sont pour deux choses, la fermeture et la protection contre l'ouverture et, je dirais, le monde, et deuxièmement, ils sont tous dans l'idée que c'était mieux hier, c'est beaucoup moins bien aujourd'hui, et ça sera encore pire demain. Et je pense que ce qui est essentiel, et en France, d'une certaine façon, le mouvement du président Macron en a fait la démonstration, c'est de dire l'inverse. C'est-à-dire, nous avons besoin d'ouverture et nous pensons que demain, pour nos enfants et nos petits-enfants, ça peut aller même mieux qu'aujourd'hui. Bon, sans remonter à l'âge d'or, etc. Ouais. Donc, ça, c'est une notion tout à fait essentielle. Et je pense que il y a un devoir d'éducation, de pédagogie essentiel dans ce domaine, de montrer quelles sont les perspectives et non pas simplement qu'il suffit de mettre en place des gouvernements réactionnaires pour traiter les problèmes qu'on n'a pas pu résoudre hier, ce qui est l'opinion de beaucoup de gens. Et puis il y a une deuxième idée, et un monsieur là-bas au fond en a parlé, sur lequel je veux revenir, c'est la tolérance. Les mouvements de ce genre sont tous extrémistes, c'est l'expression qu'on emploie, parce qu'ils sont d'abord intolérants. Ils n'admettent pas jamais la raison de l'autre et l'opinion de l'autre. Et le plus bel exemple, c'est celui naturellement du président des États-Unis qui, à travers sa post-vérité, dit toujours « Ah mais de toute façon, tout ce que vous dites, vous les journalistes, vous les démocrates, etc., tout ce que vous dites est faux, parce qu'en réalité, la vérité, c'est ce que moi, je vous explique dans mes tweets. » C'est le maximum de l'intolérance, parce que c'est même pas l'intolérance sur les opinions, c'est l'intolérance sur des faits qu'on invente et dont on reproche à l'autre de ne pas tenir compte. Naturellement, l'autre ne peut pas, puisque ces faits n'existent pas. Et donc, la tolérance. Et enfin, c'est la dernière chose que je veux dire. Quelqu'un a posé la question tout à l'heure. Bien sûr que les ombudsman et que les défenseurs des droits, les médiateurs, les avocats du peuple vont au-delà du traitement qu'ils font quotidiennement de toutes les réclamations qu'ils reçoivent pour rendre effectifs des droits qui ne le sont pas. Et dans ce rôle, il est clair qu'ils sont à contre-courant. Ils sont l'inverse des girouettes. Les ombudsman, les défenseurs des droits, ne doivent pas prendre le vent. Ils sont très souvent contre le vent. Quand ils sont contre les discours de haine, quand ils font comme moi, j'ai créé un site, une sorte de portail contre le racisme et la xénophobie, ou quand ils disent qu'il faut accueillir les migrants, quand ils disent qu'il faut cesser de dresser des murs à l'entrée de l'Europe, qu'il faut cesser de regarder impuissants les centaines et les milliers de gens qui se noient, parce que notre vocation, c'est de conduire une politique, comme l'a dit M. Sommer d'ailleurs, d'accueil et d'intégration de ceux qui arrivent, et puis d'intégration de ceux qui sont là depuis 2 ou 3 générations. Mais ça, naturellement, c'est souvent à contre-courant aujourd'hui dans les opinions publiques. Et si on suit le vent de la girouette, il est clair qu'on est contre ça. Et enfin, aujourd'hui, nous sommes tous confrontés, en particulier des pays comme la Belgique, comme l'Allemagne, comme la France, comme la Grande-Bretagne, nous sommes tous confrontés à trouver un équilibre entre les exigences légitimes de la sécurité pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les garanties du respect des libertés et des droits fondamentaux. Et là-dessus, les ombudsman, ils doivent dire attention, pour suivre l'opinion publique qui à 90% pense qu'il faut faire la guerre, qu'il faut n'importe quelle mesure en matière de sécurité, nous devons dire mais il y a des libertés et des droits fondamentaux. Si on les supprime temporairement pour lutter contre le terrorisme, est-ce que ça ne veut pas dire qu'on va les supprimer définitivement? Et est-ce que vous, citoyens, si vous réfléchissez, au lieu de vous laisser mobiliser par la peur, est-ce que vous n'êtes pas capable de comprendre qu'il y a un enjeu et que vos libertés valent mieux qu'un certain nombre de mesures à l'emporte-pièce que l'on prend, tout simplement parce que les barbares, ce qu'ils veulent, c'est justement supprimer vos libertés. Alors ne commencez pas par leur donner cette satisfaction.
Thank you very much indeed. So going against the current narrative, but also the current waves that are coming towards you. So indeed, a work of courage and bravery. Sanjay, very, very briefly, and then I'll turn to Emily for some final comments.
One way to go against the wave is to shed a spotlight on those that are doing the opposite and doing it successfully. The mayor to my left is an inspirational example of that.
Exactly.
There was a question that was asked about shrinking civic space.
Exactly.
At a time when civic space is shrinking and we are fighting it in OGP, but we have held Azerbaijan inactive because of the repression of civil space. But we also have inspirational examples like Serbia, which is using OGP to create a commitment to expand civic space. Let's shed a spotlight on that. In an environment where rights of minorities are being trampled on, we have Costa Rica, which has used the OGP process to bring indigenous people into the process unblocking history of violence, and leading to expansion of schools. In an environment where, as Emily said at the outset, citizens feel disempowered, we have another inspirational mayor, Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who has set aside 500 million euros for participatory budgeting, where citizens are voting on what they want the budget to go, and they can actually see where the money is going.
That's right.
And finally, in an environment where there's elite capture, I've shared examples, whether it's Ireland lobbying or Georgia, where citizens are, where elite capture and grand corruption are being tackled. So let's share this, but let's scale this up. But to scale this up, we need coalitions. And that's where I think ombudsmen play a really important role, but not by doing it alone, but by joining hands with others.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjay. Emily, some comments from you on the different interventions that have come from the floor, but also from the panelists.
Well, I think what comes across to me from the discussion this afternoon is that populism has many faces. And I think citizens in very many instances don't really care whether a populist is coming from the left, the right, the centre, extremes. If they offer a dream and a vision that matches the dream and the vision they have for themselves or their families, they're going to vote for them. And that's why, as has been said, you have populists coming from the right, the left. I mean, you could argue even that Mr. Macron himself has come from a populist mood, because he hasn't been tried and tested in politics to any great degree. He has come in on a particular wave, very much supported by, I think has been, you have pointed out to Mr. Dubon as well, a particular section of civil society, and certainly by no means a civil society that reflects all of the different strands of French political life. So let's see how that pans out. But I think perhaps one of the things that hasn't been raised, that maybe over the course of this seminar, is the extent to which politicians can actually solve the problems that the citizens are faced with. And I think one of the issues we haven't discussed, and I suppose we could spend several weeks doing it, is the issue of globalization, the fact of technology outpacing politics in relation to how certainly the world of work is being reconfigured. Just a small anecdote, I was out to dinner with some of my family the other evening, and we saw a Deliveroo person, somebody working in the so-called gig economy, delivering food to somebody, a young man, a young person, typical of the people who work there. And one of my daughters said to me, you know, Mum, they're great jobs because you can tell them what hours you work. You could just log on and say, I'm going to work, you know, between 5 and 6 and 7 to 9, and that's it. And I explained to her also, well, quite possibly as well, you know, that's great, but also the company may not feel any obligation to pay overtime or holidays or maternity leave or any of those things. And that is becoming a phenomenon of the world of work, and we see it. Yeah. And certainly if you look across the west coast of America, where you see services that we thought were always going to provide job, be it for students or low-skilled workers, in cafes and restaurants and so on, they are increasingly becoming automated. You also have the power of the technology companies across so many sectors of our lives, from health to the environment to media, all of that. You look at the power of Facebook. You look at the wealth of somebody like Bill Gates, the foundation that he has, which is very much involved in the WHO, in deciding, for example, or in influencing what are the health problems that the WHO is going to tackle. Those are huge issues. So maybe the reason that so many people are jumping from right-wing to left-wing to this populist to that populist is because they haven't yet found the answer within the political system. And maybe really it does go back to the political system, the extent to which it is going to try and really analyze these particular issues that are coming up and see how the political system can assert itself in these very difficult, very complex and very new challenges. And perhaps that is really the big debate we should be having.
Thank you very much indeed. So we've come to the end of our, I have to say, very informative, very instructive panel discussion. We've talked about the challenge posed by populists, but what I find actually very encouraging, we've also talked about what's needed to defeat it, to counter it, to push back. And I think this is a lesson, and I think, Sanjay, you made the point that Europe can teach to the rest of the world. People are looking at Europe, and this is something that sometimes when we're in Brussels or other capitals, we forget just how much the EU is in the spotlight on the global stage. We've talked about transparency, we've talked about accountability, people's empowerment, openness, the need to build coalitions, civil society across different spectrums. So I think we've talked about a lot of the recipes, the cures, but what is needed above all, and I think all 5 of you have said it repeatedly, is really the politics of hope. And I think this is the period and this is the moment where we really need to redefine Europe in terms of hope and not just based on borders, walls, fences, and fear. So thank you very much indeed to all 5 of you for joining this conversation. Thank you very much to all of you for bringing up some very, very pertinent points. We will meet here again at in about 20 minutes or so, because we will start talking about Brexit. And that, again, is a very, very important and timely topic for today, and I think for the next 2 or 3 years. So thank you very much. Please join me in saying thanks to our panelists. And you're not rid of me. I'll be back here in about 20 minutes or so.